Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition podcast. This is Alex Sacken, and today we're continuing our series on the secret history of the 20th century. This will be part 6, and it's called The Hidden Agenda Behind World War II. And the content that we'll be covering in this chapter follows directly upon the material that we discussed in part 5, which was on the topic of the classified science of Nikola Tesla. And in that article, we looked at the story of etheric energy and the scientific study of etheric energy and the physics paradigm built upon this study. And we investigated how these ideas were at the foundation of the work that Tesla was doing. And then around the turn of the century, these concepts and ideas, including Tesla's research that was associated with them, all this goes classified. And it basically disappears from public knowledge. And so we discussed that whole story in that previous section. So now in this article, we're going to be picking back up and looking at what role this whole situation may have played in informing the events that took place in World War II. Because these themes and ideas associated with secret research and secret science into etheric energy, etheric-based physics, and the technologies associated with them, these pop up again in the Second World War in a somewhat surprising way. So it's important that we understand the earlier story that has to do with these energies and these concepts and this physics that goes back into the 19th century up into the around the turn of the century. And then if we can keep that in mind, then we can understand the things that happen afterwards as being products of these earlier events, how these earlier events inform what happened later on. So, we should keep in mind that, the early traces of things like anti-gravity research and etheric-based energy that we talked about in the previous article, that goes back to the 1850s. So World War II was almost 100 years later. So if we can keep in mind the idea that maybe research and sort of scientific study and technological development in these fields of etheric-based energy, etheric-based physics, that these were being performed in secret in a continuous stream from at least the mid 1850s onward. That's almost a 100-year period until the start of World War II. And so if we can keep that idea in mind, it'll tell us a lot about maybe what was happening behind the scenes in that Second World War and what the real power center might have been behind events that were taking place in this period. So these are the things that we'll be discussing in this article. It's a long one. It's very kind of epic, and but it's definitely worthwhile. This is a very important topic because it sets the stage for, of course, what would happen afterwards in the Cold War and with things going up to today. So I plan on having another article that kind of revisits some of these themes that I'm going to be introducing in this article and in the follow-up on part 7 that'll be coming up soon. So really this will be like a 2-part series on the history of World War II and the circumstances that were surrounding it. And then following that one, I have a planned article on the Cold War to reframe that situation in light of this discussion that we're having here. So anyway, that's what we're doing today, and that's what's coming up. I hope you'll stay tuned. Once again, I'm Alex Sack, and this is the Wisdom Tradition podcast. And let's kick things off here with the first section, and this is called Worldview Perception Management. All right, kicking things off here, this first section is called Worldview Perception Management. And in the article, I have a picture that is going to be relevant for the content we're going to be going over here. It's a picture that illustrates the old parable of the blind men and the elephant. I don't know if you've ever heard that one. It has to do with this idea that there's 5 blind men surrounding an elephant, and each one's touching a different part, like the tail or the ears or the trunk or the legs or the torso. And because each one is blind and each is only feeling a specific part, each thinks that it's beholding a different object. Like the one holding the tail thinks it's carrying a rope, and the one holding the legs thinks it's a tree trunk. So the idea is that none of them see the whole. Each only understands the limited part that it is experiencing, and so it attempts to extrapolate from that little bit that it knows to try to gain a picture of what the whole is, and each is inaccurate. So this is going to be a kind of important analogy for what we're going to be discussing in this first section. So let's begin. In the previous article, we discussed how, over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a two-tiered system of science emerged. One public, one classified. To this day, this two-track system remains in place. The public system of science is based on ideas like Einstein's relativity model of physics, which is what we are taught in school. Generally speaking, this approach embraces a closed system, materialistic concept of existence. The classified system of science, by contrast, is much different. It is based upon a transcendent, dynamic, ether-based model of physics, one that was once embraced by pioneers like Nikola Tesla before falling out of fashion and becoming largely forgotten, at least publicly. This splitting of science is significant for many reasons, not least of which because it implies two different trajectories of technological development, one public, one classified. Over the years, a number of different sources have given reference to the existence of deeply classified, off-the-books technological research projects taking place within the innermost recesses of the national security state. For example, ether physics researcher Paul LaViolette, in his book Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion, gives an example of an encounter he had in 1992 with a scientist who claimed to have once worked on the types of hidden covert projects described above. Here is how LaViolette described the encounter. He writes, quote, "In 1992, I had an interesting telephone conversation with a man. I will identify him as Ray for reasons of confidentiality. Ray claimed to have worked on a number of black R&D projects and to have been in contact with certain other black world researchers. He told me that the physics theories that academics and most laboratory physicists currently understand, teach, and write about are grossly in error. A very advanced and much more accurate theoretical framework has been developed by scientists of the black programs community, but its fundamentals presently remain classified. From the standpoint of the new physics, modern physics concepts used in the conventional world, such as relativity theory, quantum electrodynamics, and quantum mechanics, are referred to as classical concepts. That is, they are treated as terribly outdated. According to Ray, unlike today's classical physics, the new physics does not begin with physical observables and developing its treatment of physical phenomena. Rather, it postulates the existence of an underlying reality consisting of an inherently unobservable subtle substance called an ether, which fills all space. It then defines all of its fundamental solutions to equations defined in terms of these more basic ether processes. Thus, the ether concept, so long spurned by the academic establishment, turns out to be central to this highly classified new physics. Here we come to the main point. The ether-based model of physics, once popular in the 19th century, has become classified and made top secret. Consequently, it has disappeared from public view. Why? Because of the truly transformational nature of the technologies that can be developed utilizing it. These technologies, such as the world wireless system of energy generation and transmission envisioned by Nikola Tesla in the early 20th century, would entirely overturn the global economic and political order that has been built up since the onset of the industrial era. Even more, these technologies could also be harnessed to create potentially world-ending military weapons. In a climate of competitive imperial politics, when the ruling classes are comprised of largely untutored and undisciplined oligarchs, it would be incredibly dangerous to allow this technology to come out into the open. To give an example of the godlike power that control over these technologies would provide to anyone able to harness them, let's consider Nikola Tesla's own thoughts on the matter, once published in a 1908 op-ed in the New York Times. Tesla wrote that, by means of his proposed inventions, one could alter the size of the planet, control its seasons, adjust its distance from the sun, and guide it on its eternal journey along any path he might choose through the depths of the universe. He could make planets collide and produce his suns and stars. He could originate life in all its infinite forms. In short, such technologies would give man the mastery of physical creation. These are all Tesla's words there. Tesla then went on to discuss how control of these technologies would allow a ruling elite to pick winners and losers, giving life to chosen groups by providing them with boundless energy, while eliminating life from others by withdrawing their supply of energy. In this way, the withdrawal or supply of energy will bring about the same results as those now accomplished by force of arms. Further, Tesla also described how his proposed inventions could be used to create potentially world-ending military weapons. He wrote that, quote, "When unavoidable, the same agent may be used to destroy property and life. The art is already so far developed that great destructive effects can be produced at any point on the globe, determined beforehand and with great accuracy. In view of this, I have not thought it hazardous to predict, a few years ago, that the wars of the future will not be waged with explosives, but with electrical means. If we stop and consider the incredible power and potential of the type of technologies Tesla was talking about creating, it actually makes sense why secret societies would be so desperate to shield this knowledge from falling into the wrong hands. Commenting on Tesla's thought-provoking statements, Joseph P. Farrell writes that, quote, "In other words, like the gods of extremely ancient times, Tesla saw in his technology of wireless power transmission a means of world mastery and hegemony, whose implied threat of withdrawal of access, or even worse, the implied threat of its destructive weaponized deployment, would coerce compliance to whatever world order that possessed, monopolized, and deployed it. For these reasons and more, I believe that certain far-sighted individuals and secret societies, unknown to history, made the decision back in the 19th century, if not before, to keep this entire paradigm of scientific research under wraps and hide it away from the world. In the meantime, a long-term project to prepare the world for its eventual unveiling would have to be instigated. This would require, at minimum, the formation of a centralized global system of government, with security measures put in place to prevent anyone from developing and utilizing these technologies in a competitive, destructive capacity. But how to achieve this world transformation while at the same time protecting the need for absolute secrecy? It was not only the public that would need to be shielded from this knowledge. More importantly, it was also the entire system of oligarchical control that had been built up and put into place over the course of preceding centuries. More than anyone else, these greedy and power-hungry oligarchs, the rulers of our modern capitalist-based world order, would have to be kept in the dark about the existence of these technologies. Overall, it appears that the great challenge facing the secret societies in charge of this grand project was how to bring about a world transformation in total secrecy from all parties, the masses and the ruling elite alike. No one could know what, why, or how this was happening, not the public, and most of all, not the greedy oligarchs and robber barons who had by then come into power all over Western civilization. This mandate for secrecy would require two intertwined tasks. First, the state of existing research and technological development being pursued by these secret societies must be protected and shielded from outside eyes. At the same time, outside scientists and researchers could not be allowed to independently rediscover their ideas and recreate their technology tree. Therefore, the trajectory of science and technology development within outer society would have to be tightly managed and controlled. This challenge was immense, particularly because you would need the unconscious cooperation of the same ruling elite you are hiding your research away from in order to bring about the world transformations necessary for an eventual revelation of these breakthrough technologies. The current ruling elite, the oligarchy, would need to be steered toward bringing about a global civilization, but for their own self-driven reasons. In other words, they would need to do the build-out while remaining unaware that a hidden hand behind the scenes was using them to do it. The real reason for the establishment of this global government, the one concerning the existence of secret breakthrough technologies, could never be revealed to them, lest they attempt to develop and use these technologies for their own selfish ends. Therefore, a project of worldview perception management would need to be cultivated at all levels, among the public, among the ruling elite, among everyone. In short, an all-encompassing state of total information control would be required. Looking back at the deliberate suppression of Nikola Tesla's research during the early decades of the 20th century, it appears to me as if this type of strategy was already being enacted at that point, with J.P. Morgan as one of the early targets or marks of this hidden hand. The initial suppression of Tesla's work came from J.P. Morgan, his main financier on Wall Street, and not from the direct actions of secret societies, such as those in charge of technologies like the 1890s flying airships, which were discussed in our previous article. The question is, were these societies exerting an influence upon J.P. Morgan, manipulating his worldview perception, so that he would pursue certain courses of actions that they desired? Notably, J.P. Morgan was not only a ruthless capitalist and monopolist, he was also a man deeply involved in international finance, geopolitics, and empire, helping to found important deep state institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations and the U.S. Federal Reserve. The question is, in carrying out these activities, was Morgan acting alone as a genius mastermind, or was he being secretly guided toward these actions by some unknown advisor working behind the scenes, managing his worldview and making certain well-timed suggestions? Certainly, Morgan would have been conscious of the destabilizing effect to the economic and political order that Tesla's inventions threatened to bring about. Therefore, it makes sense why he would have chosen Edison's oligarch-friendly closed system model of electricity transmission over Tesla's open systems free energy approach. After all, Edison's model promised him a fortune, while Tesla's model likely would have had the opposite effect. So was this his motivation? How much did he really understand about Tesla's ideas? How far did he actually see? And who did he entrust with Tesla's blueprints and plans once he had shut down his project? I personally wonder how much Morgan was really aware of in terms of the long-term implications of his actions. Likely, Morgan, like a true oligarch, was acting at all times in his own best interests. But his empire was so vast, he would have had to rely on a number of counselors and advisors. These advisors, serving as his second brain, would therefore be empowered to manage his perception of events, such that by advising him towards certain actions, he could be steered to bring about certain pre-desired results, ones with long-term strategic implications that Morgan himself was not even aware of. In other words, his worldview perception was being tightly managed, it being guided by more knowledgeable advisors working behind the scenes, ones who were secretly pursuing their own agenda and using him to do it. The same was likely also true for the other robber barons of the period, ones like John D. Rockefeller with his Standard Oil empire. How much were these greedy oligarchs aware of the larger role they were playing in world history, and how much were their actions being guided in a certain pre-planned direction? Certainly, synchronicity, fate, and karma play a role, but were there also very real actors and organizations working behind the scenes to secretly push world developments in a certain pre-planned direction? I think so. Overall, in my view, almost certainly Morgan, Rockefeller, and other oligarchical dynasties of the period were being controlled and handled behind the scenes by certain well-placed scientific advisors and counselors, who were manipulating them to push world events in a direction necessary for the eventual revelation of the secret technologies being developed in their hidden research labs. Just consider the fact that, at the same time that a secret, hidden tradition of science and technology was emerging, the capitalist oligarchs behind America's East Coast establishment, led by Morgan, Rockefeller, and others, were conspiring, for their own selfish reasons, to consolidate power and control over America's financial, economic, and political systems, moving to privatize and cartelize each. Furthermore, during the same period, we see the foundation of key deep state institutions like the CFR, or Council on Foreign Relations, which began work on a plan to establish America as a global imperial superpower. It seems obvious to me that these events are all linked together, with the formation of a highly compartmentalized deep state or shadow government, such as the one enabled by institutions like the CFR and Federal Reserve, serving as the perfect vehicle to shield away from public view the existence of a permanent secret scientific research institution. To continue to perpetuate itself in secret, a classified scientific research institution would need to fall under the protective auspices of a privately controlled, highly compartmentalized national security state and military-industrial complex infrastructure. And this is exactly what we see coming into existence during this key period. The projection of American power worldwide, which also begins around this time, is a necessary consequence of these moves, as America's domination of the globe would ensure that no other power moves to independently develop these technologies for themselves, allowing America to retain a monopoly on them. At the same time, the establishment of a global American empire would serve to lay the foundation for an eventual system of global government, which is a minimum requirement needed for these technologies to ever come out in the light of day. This angle on things gives us a different view of transnational imperial institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Bank of International Settlements, which we'll be discussing shortly. Perhaps these organizations serve a twin purpose, one obvious, the other less so. Each of these were put into place by the capitalist oligarchical class, seemingly for their own self-interested purpose. But these institutions are also vital for the eventual formation of world government, which will be needed in order to one day reveal the types of breakthrough technologies Tesla was talking about. So here again, we must ask, how far-sighted were the Morgans, Rockefellers, and other oligarchs responsible for setting up these institutions? Were they actually entirely self-driven evil geniuses and masterminds? Or did their greed and ambition make them predictable and thus easily manipulatable, making them perfect marks for a deeper hidden hand, which needed them to pursue certain actions for reasons these oligarchs were not even aware of? As a test of this theory, that behind the actions of America's oligarchical class were certain secret societies and well-placed advisors and counselors loyal to their interests, let's consider a case study, the Second World War. In my view, the story of the Second World War supports the idea that a dynamic, multi-level approach to understanding modern history is the correct one, with the outer public being manipulated by oligarchs who are in turn being manipulated by an unseen hidden hand, which is directing the course of world history for its own secret ends. For this reason, let's now move to examine certain often overlooked aspects of this crucial war in detail to see how the historical data matches the theory. But before beginning this effort, let's pause and consider what all might be involved in setting up a large-scale, yet hidden, scientific and technological superstructure such as the one we're implying. This secret structure would have to exist at a level of the deep state operating beneath and behind the awareness of the capitalist oligarchy and the institutions of governance that they have amassed control over. This implies that what we call the deep state is actually a multi-tiered complex, with an inner scientific core shielded by multiple outer layers comprised of oligarchs, imperialists, industrialists, and corporatists, each playing a part, but none save the inner elect aware of the whole. Here we discover the parable of the blind man and the elephant being enacted in a literal, tangible way. Each sector of society, from the outer public to the various inner levels of the deep state, is like a different blind man groping a separate part of the elephant, each diagnosing the reality of the object it is beholding according to the limited part it is able to touch and experience and cognize. The one holding the tail thinks it's encountering a snake. The one holding its leg thinks it's a tree trunk, etc. In reality, none of the blind men see or understand the whole. Keeping this analogy in mind, it appears that oligarchs like Morgan and Rockefeller are not actually the masterminds or major drivers of world events like they outwardly appear to be. Instead, they seem to be marks or instruments of a deeper, more far-sighted entity, an invisible scientific college that has taken monopolistic control over the ether-based paradigm of scientific and technological research that Tesla once advocated for. Here we come to conclude that the capitalist oligarchs are not necessarily the all-powerful, world-shaping evil geniuses that they might initially seem. Rather, these capitalists exist ultimately as disposable assets being maneuvered without their knowledge by an obscure and invisible hidden hand operating behind the scenes. Rather than being the primary movers behind world affairs, they are actually moved. In other words, they are mere actors playing a part, guided into place like chess pieces by a deeper, more far-sighted scientific core who is using them as a means toward the accomplishment of an ultimate end, known only to itself. Whatever the ultimate end to be achieved is, at minimum it features a hierarchically centralized system of world government possessing full spectrum dominance like security measures, this being exactly the type of system needed if the type of technologies Tesla once talked about developing were ever to safely be brought out into the light of day. So that's the end of this kickoff section. It was a long one, but I wanted to lay out my basic thesis. So once again, that was called Worldview Perception Management, and that's really about the project or the challenge that would be faced by the secret research institution that I've been implying exists. That this is what they would face in terms of protecting their assets, their research and their technologies, and at the same time preventing others from independently inventing what they're working on. And at the same time, in order to ever actually bring these technologies out, they need to consolidate the world order into a global system that's centralized and hierarchically controlled. And so they would have had to basically engineer a world reformation project in order to bring about these goals and to meet these challenges. So in order to do so, I'm saying that this campaign of worldview perception management has been enacted at every level of society. And part of that means that what we consider the power elite, which would be like the oligarchs, the wealthy capitalists and sort of corporatists behind Wall Street and the major corporations, that these people are actually not the movers and shapers as they might seem, but they are just one more level of mark, so to speak. Or agent to be manipulated by this inner structure. And you could even go deeper and say that the military industrial complex itself and whatever research scientists that are working there are themselves also sort of agents to be manipulated, in the sense that if back in the 19th century certain breakthroughs were made, and so a certain idea about the trajectory of this research and the technology tree that it can produce, if that had already been discovered in advance, then by the 20th century, by the time we see the militaries of the West, Germany and America most specifically, but later Russia, start to turn their attention towards the development of these type of technologies, then those who already have it worked out know where the breakthroughs lay in the research, and in that way that they can guide from behind the scenes the gradual rediscovery of certain key concepts and technologies within the overt military structure of the West. And in this way, they're managing their worldview, so to speak. They're managing their development of these technologies and their breakthroughs, and how they're using them, and how they view themselves in relation to the world. All these things are managed as part of this all-encompassing process. So the outer society is managed, the inner sort of power elite is being managed, and that's the scope of the campaign necessary to protect this structure. And so before moving on, I just want to point out that in the last section, the last article, I introduced this idea of reframing the 20th century. And so ultimately, I think that behind this secret scientific research structure is the modern incarnation of the mystery schools. And so that ancient institution is initiatic in nature. So we can look at this whole thing that we're talking about, this whole system of world structure that has been put into place, and you can kind of keep in mind that really what we're describing here is a grand system of initiation that's happening on multi different levels. But the world's soul is undergoing this transformation, and it's being led into this by this great drama that's being enacted around this sort of great geopolitical game, and this move to investigate these mysteries of the ether. So let's move on. That's the end of that first section. That was called Worldview Perception Management, and now we're going to be moving on and revisiting some of these themes, developing them further. In the next section, it's called What Secrecy Requires: Total Information Control. So let's get into that. All right, what secrecy requires: total information control. Historian Richard Dolan has spent his career researching the U.S. national security state and its decades-long reaction and response to the UFO phenomenon. In his research, discussed in works such as UFOs in the National Security State, he uncovers how the topic of secret science has emerged repeatedly within the U.S. military-industrial complex as a prominent theme. In modern history, what we call UFOs initially came onto the scene in the form of steampunk-esque flying airships of the 19th century. Only decades later, once research and technology became more advanced, did they come to take shape in the now famous flying saucer form. As I've been arguing, anti-gravity technology like that demonstrated by UFOs has been developed and prototyped at an extremely secret core level of the American national security state since at least the 19th century. Protecting and shielding this secret structure, hiding it away from outside view, is a vast, highly compartmentalized network of public-private partnerships with the Navy, Air Force, and other outward public-facing branches of the U.S. military-industrial complex serving as key components of the vast exterior shell built around this concealed inner structure. Crucially, this whole operation has been put into place in such a way that these outer military branches are not even aware of what it is they are concealing, or even that they are concealing anything at all. Elaborating on this idea, Dolan explains how layer upon layer of secrecy would need to be established to hide these secret technology programs from outside awareness. To meet this need, it has become the norm within the black budget world that such a program would be nested within other classified programs, providing deep layers of protection from outside observation. Because of this compartmentalized need-to-know structure, the commanding officers of the military's various outward departments would be kept aloof from what is happening within the national security state's inner core. For this reason, to them, the UFO phenomenon would appear as an unknown factor, an outside threat even, one that would engender certain highly predictable responses from military leadership. One of these would be to institutionalize a culture of absolute secrecy and total information control within the American national security state, something needed by its secret inner technological core. Further, the existence of unknown aerial crafts performing unexplainable and seemingly impossible maneuvers would necessitate research into new paradigms of physics by the military, ones that it would have no incentive to share with or reveal to the public. In order to perform this research, the military would need to rely on private contractors for the build-out of their secret research facilities. This gives the private corporate contractors the potential capacity to influence the trajectory of progress being made in these secret government research programs from the top down. If a yet deeper and more advanced scientific research society was in turn controlling these contractors, then it could manage from the inside the development of the military's own research into breakthrough energy technologies, making sure that they don't advance too quickly toward mastery of this new physics paradigm. Zooming out, we discover that, from the perspective of a secret research corps existing at the heart of the U.S. national security state, the UFO phenomena serves as an invaluable instrument for enacting an elaborate worldview perception management campaign on the American military-industrial complex itself, guiding it to adopt an institutional architecture governed by absolute secrecy and compartmentalization, the very structure that this deeper secret core needs in order to protect and shield its own research activities, which are much more advanced than what the U.S. deep state institutions are working to rediscover. In his writings, Dolan offers support to these observations, explaining how it would be only natural that, from the perspective of America's overt military leadership, the vexing scientific problem presented by the UFO would result in the formulation of a culture of absolute secrecy emerging across the U.S. government, one characterized by secrecy protocols, censorship, and even disinformation from agencies charged with protecting what would arguably be the most important secret in the world. The legacy of the system of total information control that has been established surrounding these projects can be observed all around us every day. For example, Dolan asks us to consider how science is conducted today. How independent is it really? And in whose interest is it practiced? This is no idle question. In support of his point, Dolan, in his book UFOs for the 21st Century Mind, cites contemporary scientist James Lovelock, who describes the financial and political influences acting upon and influencing the trajectory of modern scientific research. Lovelock points out that today, nearly all scientists are employed by some large organization, such as a governmental department, a university, or a multinational company. Only rarely are they free to express their science as a personal view. They may think that they are free, but in reality they are, nearly all of them, employees. They have traded freedom of thought for good working conditions, a steady income, tenure, and a pension. Adding to Lovelock's point, Dolan observes that science is an expensive business. To do it well, you need money, which means sponsorship. And when someone else is paying the bills, they make the rules. And who writes the checks? In most nations, it is usually either private industry or a government defense agency. Certainly, this is so in the U.S., where, since the Second World War, the military has been the largest sponsor of scientific research. Furthermore, Dolan observes that if the military and intelligence communities have had a strong interest in the UFO phenomenon and deeply classified the subject, we would certainly have a situation in which government public funds for UFO research would be absent, but in which black budget, classified dollars would flow more freely. This would have a clear effect on the state of public scientific discourse, as the lack of public funds for research in alternate physics paradigms like ether theory would have the effect of steering academics away from studying it. As Dolan points out, if there is no public funding for scientific research into UFOs, or for the classified physics model that explains them, then few if any scientists will give it any consideration. They would have nothing to gain and everything to lose for their efforts. The result is widespread ignorance of these topics by the vast majority of professional academics and public intellectuals, a highly desired outcome by the secret research core of the national security state. Dolan points out that, as an inevitable consequence of a hidden hand mucking around with scientific knowledge's natural developmental pathway, through the years and decades and generations, such a long-lasting cover-up would create a strong discrepancy between what we might call official truth and the actual truth. In this manner, a two-tiered system of science can be maintained perpetually. One tier existing as the real system of science, the other as a modern form of myth, a belief system sold to the public as a distraction to keep its eyes away from peering into the deeper mysteries of nature's secrets. But there is a consequence to the state of total secrecy required to maintain this system. As Dolan writes, the suppression of open public information about UFOs and the etheric science behind them has created serious distortions in our political culture and our economics. A key factor here has been the creation of an expansive national security apparatus and black budget society, which was created to hide the UFO reality. In short, in order to protect the existence of a permanently secret scientific and technology research institution, a culture of absolute secrecy and total information control within the military-industrial complex would have to be strategically maneuvered into place. Dolan emphasizes how, once such a secret system is in place, it would become necessary to manage key institutions to keep them compliant. You would need to start with the academic, scientific, journalistic, and political institutions, developing relationships with key members of those groups who would then serve as watchdogs, keeping the rest of the pack in line whenever someone strayed too far into forbidden topics and research areas. Any and all tools would be necessary. By necessity, to maintain itself, this apparatus has taken over much of what remains of traditional Republican institutions around the world, certainly within the United States. For example, even Congress could not be told about this system, or else the secret obviously would not last long. But keeping Congress in the dark would require the creation of otherwise illegal secret appropriations, in other words, black budgets. In short, it would be absolutely necessary to do an end run around the Constitution. From an operations and management standpoint, the financing, supplying of, and protection of a secret scientific research institution of the type being described would require tactical use of public-private partnerships. The public side would interface primarily with the military. The private side would incorporate both the private Federal Reserve banking institution as well as key military contractors and industrial corporations. Dolan elaborates, noting that research into breakthrough science and technology such as that exhibited by UFOs would need to be passed on to those groups within private industry that are best suited to study and hopefully replicate it. Aerospace contractors like Boeing and Lockheed Martin fit the bill, although they are not by any means the only ones involved. Dolan points out that studies of the black budget world, for instance, have emphasized that at the deepest levels of secrecy, it is not official Defense Department personnel, but private contractors who usually dominate most of the special access programs, that is, black budget programs. To function, these contractors require payment, but secretly. Official channels couldn't be used or the structure would reveal itself. This is where black budgets and the privatized central banking system of the Federal Reserve come into play. These work together to facilitate the secret flow of money into the secret scientific core of the military-industrial complex, financing the development of their technologies, as well as the elaborate and highly expensive system of secrecy required to keep it hidden. As should be obvious, the maintenance of a system of total information control would also necessitate an active, ongoing campaign of public perception management, one that would seek to steer public awareness away from anything that could destabilize the prevailing social order, because this prevailing social order is one that allows this secret scientific research apparatus to be kept entirely secret and hidden. Consequently, Richard Dolan emphasizes that such a program of secret study would require ongoing influence and even control over mainstream radio, newspapers, and television. This does not mean the CIA would control every piece of information coming through the media, but it might mean, however, that there would be key, strategically placed individuals who would influence stories as they came out, in other words, spin control, promoting certain types of stories and killing others. What this means is that we have an upside-down reality. The things that are real are the things that are denied to us, with the things that we see in our entertainment-dominated mass media being the most illusory. This is no accident. Given the long-term relationship between the intelligence community and mainstream media, it is most reasonable to assume that the public is being subjected to a pacification program, one in which people are explicitly being distracted and brainwashed for the purpose of getting them to sit down and shut up. That's all from Richard Dolan. To maintain a secret scientific research institution on a permanent basis, public perception is not the only realm where information control would need to be engineered. As discussed previously, various levels of private contractors, government bureaucrats, and politicians would also need to be managed, as these are the people whose manpower makes the whole project work. The whole enterprise would need to be highly compartmentalized, with each part knowing only enough to do its job and fulfill its role, but no more. Therefore, each branch and component of the military-industrial complex would need to be profiled and their access to information managed, so that each of its members could perform its specific role without knowing too much or straying into dangerous territory. To pull off this all-encompassing worldview perception management operation, a deep study of human psychology would need to be pursued and leveraged for the sake of secrecy. Here we find that the secret scientific core of the national security state would be required not only to develop an expertise on the subject of etheric physics and the development of technologies using it, they would also need to develop a deep expertise in the realm of human psychology so as to become masters of deception. As Joseph P. Farrell observes, the psychological warfare officer must be able to play an enemy's mind like a violin. This implies a deep knowledge of human psychology, which is itself a kind of black art. There wouldn't really be a choice in the matter. For very real security reasons, the ruling elite behind this central project would be forced to manipulate the masses, disguising what is true and emphasizing what is false. This is a type of black magic, but perhaps an unavoidable one. Is this the inherited karma of our Atlantean pasts, coming back now to haunt us? And that's the end of the section. So once again, that was called What Secrecy Requires, Total Information Control. And there I try to go over the different levels that would be required of this kind of operation, citing Richard Dolan to do so. All right, so moving on now, the next section is called Propaganda and Applied Science, and we're going to go into the origins of propaganda as a applied science, which emerges during the same period that all these other activities that we're talking about first emerge, meaning the consolidation of the military-industrial complex into this highly secret structure. So again, this is in the period around World War I and going into World War II, where propaganda first really matures as a applied science. All right, propaganda and applied science. The science of psychology and its military application in the form of propaganda first emerged in a mature form in the early decades of the 20th century. It was the Swiss scientist Carl Jung who initially pioneered psychology as a scientific enterprise, while also developing the protocols around its application as a therapeutic practice. And I have a whole publication about this, so please see that. There's a bunch of podcast episodes in 2021 that I did on this topic as well. The weaponization of psychology in the form of propaganda was pioneered by a different group of scientists, however, ones driven by very different motivations than the more mystically minded Jung. The psychologists who invented propaganda and the field of public relations were more like consultants. They had little interest in the therapeutic applications of psychological knowledge, nor did they seek their knowledge as part of a quest for a better philosophic understanding of human nature. Rather, to them, knowledge about human psychology was valuable to the extent that it could be weaponized in order to exert influence and power over the thinking and behavior of targeted people and groups. The two early pioneers of this approach were Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann. Working in the early decades of the 20th century, they approached the topic of human psychology from an entirely different angle, as did Jung. Their goal was simple: to establish psychology as an applied science for use in military and commercial applications. Their efforts began in the period directly preceding America's entry into World War I, with their initial work being targeted toward the effort of convincing Americans to support a war they had no interest in entering. At the time, America was largely an immigrant nation, featuring an especially large German population. Consequently, there was little desire among a majority of the population to get involved in what many considered a European war, one being waged against a country, Germany, that many Americans held deep family connections to. But for reasons discussed in previous articles, the oligarchs who had gained control of the economic and political systems of the American nation had a different objective in mind. They planned to utilize the war as a means to displace the declining British Empire, replacing it with a new American imperium, a Pax Americana. These oligarchs saw the new field of public relations that Bernays and Lippmann were pioneering as an invaluable instrument for shaping public opinion in the direction they wanted it to go in. Therefore, to these oligarchs, the science of psychology became seen as just another weapon in their arsenal, one of many to be utilized as a means of establishing their long-desired global imperium. Delving into the details of this story, F. William Engdahl informs us how the official beginning of the U.S. government's use of propaganda came in 1917, when President Woodrow Wilson, a friend to the oligarchy, created the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, which was founded with the aim of both promoting the war effort at home and advertising American war interests abroad. As Engdahl informs us, Bernays and Lippmann were two of the most influential voices within the CPI. There, they combined advertising techniques with a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The work they did together marked the first time that a government disseminated propaganda on such a large scale. The psychological concepts they utilized were originally ported over from the work of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung's intellectual nemesis, via Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew and literary agent in America. Under Bernays' influence, at CPI, the Freudian view of human nature was combined with what became Madison Avenue advertising techniques. More specifically, Bernays' unique, perverse genius for fusing mob psychology and mass media techniques was leveraged to manipulate specific human emotions on a large scale. the results they achieved were deployed by the U.S. oligarchy in the service of their war effort. Engdahl emphasizes how, based on Bernays' ideas, a primary focus for CPI analysts became to formulate targeted public relations campaigns aimed specifically at stimulating a desired emotional response within the public psyche. He informs us that emotional agitation was a favorite technique of the CPI strategists, who understood that any emotion may be drained off and redirected into any activity by skillful manipulation. For example, in the propaganda campaign enacted around World War I, the calculated publication of highly sensational atrocity stories was used as a primary tactic aimed at manipulating the emotional state of the public. As part of this campaign, the unwitting American public was assaulted with a calculated barrage of lies and jingoistic epithets demonizing Germans, coupled with horrifying images allegedly showing German soldiers bayoneting Belgian babies and other manufactured atrocities. These images and symbols were fed continuously through the mainstream media in order to whip the American public into a pro-war frenzy against a nation, Kaiser Germany, which posed no actual threat to it. Outlining the strategic rationale that the CPI used to justify this kind of tactic, one early political scientist who studied this campaign, Harold Lasswell, observed that so great are the psychological resistances to war in modern nations that every war must appear to be a war of defense against a menacing, murderous aggressor. There must be no ambiguity about who the public is to hate. Given that, not long after the CPI was formed, America would enter the Great War, with patriotic men and boys pledging their lives to join the army in support of it, it is clear that their tactics were highly effective. As Engdahl emphasizes, the Committee on Public Information achieved extraordinary results within months, orchestrating the American public into a mass frenzy in favor of war. If only the American public could have known what was actually happening, and of the elitist and patronizing attitude that the oligarchs behind this campaign held towards them. The perspective of these oligarchs was revealed by Lasswell, a major figure at the time in U.S. political science. At first defining propaganda as the management of collective attitudes by the manipulation of significant symbols, he concluded that it was essential to the modern functioning of democracy because individuals were poor judges of their own interests and so had to be helped by officially sanctioned communication. Lippmann, one of CPI's initial agents, was one of those tasked with helping the American people fall in love with the idea of war. Through his influential and widely syndicated bi-weekly column in the New York Herald Tribune, Lippmann worked to persuade the American people to embrace the war effort, while leveraging the CPI's targeted strategy of appealing to the emotions of the public to do so, thereby enhancing the effectiveness of his campaign. Soon after the war's completion, in 1922, Walter Lippmann published a landmark book called Public Opinion, where he revealed some of the ideas and methods CPI had developed in their work with propaganda during the war. Lawrence Friedman, a contemporary military strategist, summarizes Lippmann's writings. Quote, "What people knew," he argued, "was only through a picture in their heads of the pseudo-environment to be found between people and their real environment." So again, this is Lippmann's views. This is the original cohort of propagandists. So he writes that what people knew was only through a picture in their heads of the pseudo-environment to be found between people and their real environment. In other words, through projections. So understanding the way that these psychological pictures were formed, sustained, and challenged was important because it affected behavior. So by implication, if you could manipulate these images, you could control human behavior. Lippmann also noted the extent to which individuals desperately clung onto their now personal system of stereotypes because it provided an ordered, more or less consistent picture of the world to which our habits, our tastes, our capacities, our comforts, and our hopes have adjusted themselves. Correspondingly, any disturbance of the stereotypes seems like an attack upon the foundations of the universe. And actually, it is an attack, but only on the foundations of our personal universe. So these ideas come together to suggest a dynamic whereby public opinion can be shaped and manipulated en masse. If you first build up a certain identity pattern or stereotype within the public mind, such as American patriotism, you can then manufacture a challenge to that identity, such as the image of a devilish German soldier performing atrocities, which will result in the exertion of a predictable public response. This public response can then be engineered to justify and support a pre-specified end goal, such as the support for America's entry into World War I. A year after Lippmann published his initial book, Edward Bernays, also of the CPI, published his own titled Crystallizing Public Opinion. A few years later, he would also write a follow-up simply titled Propaganda. In these books, Bernays makes clear the cynical elitist mentality that the CPI's propagandists and their oligarchical backers held toward the public at large. Friedman elaborates, noting that what was striking about Bernays' book was the blunt language he used to describe what public relations professionals could offer and the presumption of success. In his first book, Crystallizing Public Opinion, Bernays explained how, quote, the natural inherent flexibility of individual human nature made it possible for governments to regiment the mind like the military regiments the body. Therefore, by studying the mechanism and motives of the group mind, it would be possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing about it. This, he thought, could be done at least up to a certain point and within certain limits. In his later book, Bernays transparently stated that it was of course the astounding success of propaganda during the war that opened the eyes of the intelligent few to the possibilities of regimenting the public mind in this manner. By implication, from then on out, the human psyche would become the victim of a constant bombardment from all manner of public relations campaigns, each tasked with manipulating the psyche in various pre-planned directions, ones dictated by whoever is financing the campaign. Bernays also stated in Propaganda that those responsible for enacting these campaigns constituted an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Consequently, by means of this hidden hand, we are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. In subsequent decades, the ideas of Bernays, Lippmann, and the propagandists at CPI would be further developed, resulting eventually in the formulation of an all-encompassing strategic outlook called worldview warfare, which the Germans called Weltanschauungskrieg. I think that's how they pronounce it. And this was pioneered by Nazi psychologists during the Second World War. In his writings, Joseph P. Farrell elaborates on the scope and nature of this information warfare initiative, which involves the purportedly scientific application of propaganda, terror, and state pressure as a means of securing an ideological victory over one's enemies. Worldview warfare is thus a kind of psychological warfare version of full-spectrum dominance of all aspects of a target population's interpretive and decision-making faculties. This is accomplished by the employment of all of the techniques of mass communication, propaganda, and the all-important component, the calculated application of terror, as well as use of other forms of emotional appeal, such as those articulated by Bernays and Lippmann. Considering these notions, we begin to appreciate the scope of the all-encompassing worldview perception management campaign that the custodians of America's secret scientific research corps would have had to enact in order to protect and shield their inventions and discoveries from outside interference. The full-spectrum worldview warfare they would have had to carry out to conceal themselves is one that would need to be aimed not only at concealing their own work from outside discovery, but also to prevent its independent rediscovery and reinvention by other scientific researchers. As Joseph Farrell elaborates, these two aims are quite the crucial points, for on the one hand, such a secret scientific institution must seek both to cloak the technologies it is utilizing, and by implications its own very existence, while on the other hand, obfuscating the interpretation of its technologies in case they are discovered. Meanwhile, while protecting itself, this corps would also need to extend branches out into the scientific research apparatuses of every state and nation, ensuring that its ideas and technologies don't become independently rediscovered by rival camps. In order to succeed in this campaign, this secret scientific institution would need to develop the capacity to manipulate human psychology at a deep and fundamental level, an act which is itself a kind of black art. But was it a necessary one? Has this whole pattern been inevitable, the inescapable result of a deep karmic pattern whose origins stretch back into the deep recesses of human history? So again, you can kind of faintly discern a type of Atlantean karma in all this, in my opinion. But I won't go too much into that because we have a lot of material to cover. So anyway, that's the end of that section. Once again, that was called Propaganda and Applied Science. And now we're going to move on. This next section is called the Bank of International Settlements, the Central Bank of Central Banks. All right, the Bank of International Settlements, the Central Bank of Central Banks. As we will be covering, the all-encompassing system of secrecy and control described in the above sections was strategically maneuvered into place over the course of the 20th century. The Second World War was key to this effort. It served as a means to solidify a permanent state of secrecy, compartmentalization, and off-the-book scientific research within the American national security establishment. Then, after the war, a second global conflict, the decades-long Cold War between America and Soviet Russia, was engineered into place as an additional means to further solidify into place a national security culture that embraces, as one of its fundamental tenets, the policy of total information control. To understand how all this came together, we have to start at the beginning, in the interwar period of the 20s and 30s, a time period we've covered before and must now revisit. In particular, we have to track the emergence of the Transnational Bank of International Settlements, or BIS, and investigate the role it played in financing, protecting, and coordinating the flow of black budget funds into the deeply hidden scientific core of America's military-industrial complex. As you'll remember from our discussion in Part 4 of this series, the interwar period was a time when U.S. bankers worked to consolidate their control over the international financial system, taking it away from the British Empire's control and moving it instead to Wall Street. In particular, the Dawes and Young plans for war reparations, prepared by America's banking elite, were two key mechanisms involved with managing this shift in power and bringing it over to America. The system for organizing the flow of war reparations into America was coordinated at the level of each nation's central bank. Therefore, the whole program depended upon the work of a small handful of key technocrats, the central bank finance ministers, who manned the central banks of America, Britain, France, and Germany, the four key countries involved in carrying out the First World War. By name, the four finance ministers involved were Hjalmar Schacht of the Reichsbank, Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve, Montague Norman of the Bank of England, and Charles Rist of the Bank of France. These four individuals held close relations with each other, as well as to the private banking houses who controlled the monetary wealth of each of their nations. They also were intimately connected with the military-industrial complexes and deep states of their respective countries. Therefore, we should understand that they were not just capitalists, but rather wore many hats. Consequently, their true allegiances and motives remain hard to specify, but it seems that more was going on than just the pure pursuit of wealth. The ultimate end these finance ministers would work to bring about was to establish a centralized international banking system ruled over and directed by private banking interests. Via the BIS, or Bank of International Settlements, these corporate banking interests and the industrial cartels they partnered with would be empowered to take over the responsibility for coordinating global financial and economic planning, moving this privilege out of the hands of national governments and placing it instead in the hands of private interests. The question is, was this done merely to further enrich and empower these private interests, the capitalist oligarchy, as it outwardly appears, or were other, less obvious goals also being pursued behind the scenes? Could these policies, while on one level serving the oligarchical class, making them fat with wealth, have also inwardly served additional secondary purposes, ones that the oligarchy wasn't even aware of, but which were necessary to the maintenance of a secret scientific core to America's national security state? As we will see, while on one hand the interwar financial system these technocrats put into place did serve to enrich and empower the capitalist classes of their respective nations, they also served a secret secondary function, to set up a transnational financial system free from state control and regulatory oversight. To any party interested in obtaining off-the-books black budget financing for secret military research projects, this is exactly the type of system they would need. The key institution that allowed this plan to work was the Bank of International Settlements, which the above-mentioned finance ministers put into place during the interwar time period. Therefore, the story of how this transnational banking institution came into being is vital to understand, because it reveals, in part at least, the idea that there is a deeper purpose to the global financial system beyond just oligarchical corruption. The corruption is a mask, in other words, one that effectively hides something deeper and infinitely more interesting. Let's begin our investigation of the BIS by first reconsidering the statements of Carroll Quigley, the famous Georgetown professor cited in a previous article, who researched and wrote extensively on the history of banking, capitalism, and oligarchy. In the 1960s, Quigley wrote, in no uncertain terms, that the powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent meetings and conferences. According to this plan, each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. Quickly reveals that the apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Because of the vital role that this international central bank to central banks would come to play in the Second World War and in the decades following, the story of how it was initially founded is key. The circumstances that led up to its initial founding were established in the 20s and 30s during the interwar period, when the issue of war reparations was central. In short, this was the dynamic involved. Germany, having had its economy destroyed, was placed under harsh sanctions aimed at preventing its reindustrialization. At the same time, it was made responsible for shouldering the burden of Britain and France's war debts to the United States. Clearly, this was an untenable situation, and it eventually set the stage in 1924 for the Morgan faction of the American deep state to step in with its own prepackaged solution, the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan was built around the creation of an inherently unsustainable debt pyramid. In essence, here's how it worked. In order to pay its war reparations to Britain and France, Germany borrowed money from America, around $800 million. This money was sent to the British and French, initially in the form of goods and later in the form of monetary payments. Then, receiving this money, these two allied countries, England and France, turned around and gave it back to the Americans as a means to satisfy their own war debts, which had been built up over the course of the war. So in essence, the Germans were lent dollars, which they then gave to the British and French, who completed the cycle by giving them back to the Americans. In reality, the system was more complicated, but that's basically the dynamic that played out. Discussing this system, Quigley comments that the only things wrong with it were that it would collapse as soon as the United States ceased to lend, and in the meantime, debts were merely being shifted from one account to another, and no one was really getting any nearer to solvency. Nothing was settled by all this, but the international bankers sat in heaven, under a rain of fees and commissions. But was the plan really implemented only to benefit the bankers? As we go further, we'll see that clearly this is not the case. There was a game behind the game, one that even the Wall Street oligarchs were aloof to, they being happy and content with the enormous amount of money they were making. One consequence of the Dawes Plan and its later follow-up, the Young Plan, was that it set the stage for the foundation of an international bank to facilitate these debt payments. The Bank of International Settlements was the creation that resulted, an international central bank formed for the explicit purpose of linking together the central banks of the nations involved in this post-war debt payment system. As Quigley explains, the BIS as a private institution was owned by the 7 chief central banks and was operated by the heads of these, who together formed its governing board. Each of these kept a substantial deposit at the BIS and periodically settled payments among themselves, and thus between the major countries of the world, by bookkeeping in order to avoid shipments of gold. What's interesting is that, despite the fact that this system in its initial implementation worked to enrich the Wall Street banks behind America's military-industrial complex, ones headed by figures like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller, the system was actually originally conceived by Germany's finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht. So it's just notable that the whole system was ostensibly run to benefit America because America was the one who was the recipient of all this money that was being transacted. But actually, the Americans weren't the ones who originated the idea for the system. It was this figure, Hjalmar Schacht, who becomes a key figure, as we'll be exploring in this World War II time period. So picking back up, according to one scholar of the BIS, Schacht had originally pushed for an institution that would retain channels of communication and collusion between the world's financial leaders, even in the event of an international conflict. It was written into the bank's charter and concurred by the respective governments that the BIS should be immune from seizure, closure, or censure, whether or not its owners were at war. Shortly after its creation, World War II would break out, giving this charter its first true test. And, true to its purpose, after the war began, the BIS, seated in neutral Switzerland, did in fact continue to function in its intended role as a financial linking mechanism between nations, even those engaging in war with each other. Anthony Sutton elaborates, noting that the BIS continued its work during the World War as the medium through which the bankers, who apparently were not at war with each other, continued a mutually beneficial exchange of ideas, information, and planning for the post-war world. Apparently, war made no difference to the international bankers. Elaborating on this situation, Sutton cites BIS historian Henry Schloss, who wrote that, quote, the fact that the bank possessed a truly international staff did, of course, present a highly anomalous situation in a time of war. An American president was transacting the daily business of the bank through a French general manager who had a German assistant general manager, while a secretary general was an Italian subject. Other nationalities occupied other posts. These men were, of course, in daily personal contact with each other. And through the founding of the Bank of International Settlements, we find a global financial institution being set up that was essentially self-governing, it operating independently of the governmental oversight and control of any single nation. Even in a time of war, it continued to conduct business as usual, with bankers and bureaucrats from various nationalities working together to facilitate central banking activity at a transnational level. By design, the technocrats in charge of the system were intended to be free from the control of their respective national governments. This allowed them to pursue a suite of policies free from governmental oversight or involvement. As we will see, this became important because it would be utilized to finance the integration of an interlinked transnational cartel system, one that would bind together German industrial cartels like IG Farben with American ones like Standard Oil and General Electric. These were then bound together by means of an elaborate network of interlocking corporate directorates and in financial investment portfolios. So this is what we're going to be going into. This is important. The financial structure that we're talking about, transnational interlinking banking thing, was immediately utilized in order to facilitate and establish a transnational cartel arrangement of industrial corporations between these same countries, but most notably America and Germany. So on a financial level, there's a link here, and then boom, immediately there's this industrial linkage that's coming into place. So now we're seeing a transnational sort of semi-autonomous banking institution now being tethered to a similar apparatus of industry taking place. So this is all being set up before the war. Through this transnational cartel system, set up by the same private banking interests governing the BIS system, the vast and powerful military-industrial complexes of America, Germany, and other nations became covertly linked together, such that their strategic actions could be coordinated from the top down at a secret hidden level of planning. Thus, while America and Germany were outwardly at war with each other during World War II, this conflict was taking place only on one level. At another deeper level, their privately held banking institutions and industrial cartels were actively coordinating and collaborating together. The question is why? Clearly, some unseen player behind the scenes had a greater plan in mind in setting up this system. None of this happened by accident. And that's the end of that section. So that was called the Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of central banks. The next section, we're going to be going deeper into the story. It's called Wartime Collusion Between German and American Industrial Cartels. So I previewed that just now, and now we'll be going into the details. All right, moving along. Next section, Wartime Collusion Between German and American Industrial Cartels. As we previously discussed, the idea for the Bank of International Settlements is said to have initially been inspired by the central bank finance minister of Germany, Hjalmar Schacht. At least this is what he claims in his own autobiography. In actuality, whether it was really he who originated the concept or whether he was instead merely its recipient, an instrument through which it could be brought into existence acting on behalf of greater powers, is up for debate. I tend to lead toward that latter explanation. One of the reasons I think this is because the transnational banking institution he was working to establish would almost immediately be utilized to covertly link together the industrial cartels of America and Germany, the two powerhouses behind the Second World War. Schacht would have no control over the fact that German and American corporate industrialists were keen to collaborate together, exchanging technology, intellectual property, stock shares, and corporate directorates. But this is exactly what happened almost immediately after Schacht worked to establish the BIS. Clearly, a larger strategy and game plan was being enacted. It can't be a coincidence that right at the same time global bankers start linking up and collaborating, global industrialists also begin doing the same. Undoubtedly, the whole thing is being coordinated by a secret guiding hand working behind the scenes, which is operating with a larger vision and purpose in mind, one that only a select few individuals would be fully aware of. Seemingly, Schacht was an instrument of this hidden hand, selected to bring about key aspects of its plan. Others were involved too. The fix was in. According to Joseph P. Farrell, before the war, Schacht moved in the elite circles of American and German corporate and banking power. Could have been through a secret society or agent situated within these elite circles that Schacht first obtained his idea for the BIS, a world community of money that would be independent of wars and empires. The mystery around Schacht deepens when we consider that not only was he working to mastermind the formation of the BIS, he was also working behind the scenes to consolidate German industry within a huge cartel structure. As Farrell further informs us, Schacht held close connections with industrialist Karl Krauch and German Schmitz, whom he aided to found the huge IG Farben chemicals cartel. This is important because IG Farben was the industrial giant who almost single-handedly dominated the entire wartime German military-industrial complex. What many will be shocked to discover is that before and during the war, IG Farben held close corporate and financial connections with powerful American banks and industrial cartels such as Standard Oil, General Electric, and Ford. Thus, we find that the key industrial suppliers behind the German and American militaries, who were actively fighting against each other on one level, were at the same time, behind the scenes, secretly linked together in a tight system of corporate partnership. Hjalmar Schacht was clearly an important player in setting up this international system of industrial cartels. This is proved by the fact that the flow of American loan money moving into Germany through the Dawes Plan, facilitated by the BIS, was used with the explicit purpose of setting up the IG Farben cartel, as well as that of the steel cartel, United Steel Works, also called Vereinigte Stahlwerke. In other words, the Americans specified that these industrial cartels should be created using their loan money. The question again is, why? Delving into the details of the situation, Anthony Sutton informs us that the Dawes Plan arranged a series of foreign loans totaling $800 million, with their proceeds flowing to Germany. These loans are important for our story because the proceeds were utilized in the mid-20s to create and consolidate the gigantic chemical and steel combinations of IG Farben and United Steelworks, respectively. These cartels not only helped Hitler to power in 1933, they also produced the bulk of key German war materials used in World War II. Zooming out, he points out that the buildup for European war both before and after 1933 was in great part due to Wall Street financial assistance in the 1920s to create the German cartel system, and to technical assistance from well-known American firms to build the German Wehrmacht. In his book, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Sutton further explores the linkages between American and German industrial corporations, going into great detail. Here he informs us that the contribution made by American capitalism to German war preparations before 1940 can only be described as phenomenal. It was certainly crucial to German military capabilities. To give an example, he cites the linkage between Rockefeller's Standard Oil empire and Germany's IG Farben. The Standard Oil group of companies, in which the Rockefeller family owned a 1/4 and controlling interest, was of critical assistance in helping Nazi Germany prepare for World War II. This assistance in military preparation came about because Germany's relatively insignificant supplies of crude petroleum were quite insufficient for modern mechanized warfare. In 1934, for instance, about 85% of German finished petroleum products were imported. The solution adopted by Nazi Germany was to manufacture synthetic gasoline from its plentiful domestic coal supplies. It was the hydrogenation process of producing synthetic gasoline and isooctane properties in gasoline that enabled Germany to go to war in 1940. And this hydrogenation process was developed and financed by the Standard Oil laboratories in the United States in partnership with IG Farben. The transfer of synthetic oil technologies for the Nazi war machine was repeated in the case of synthetic rubber. There is no question that the ability of the German Wehrmacht to fight World War II depended on synthetic rubber, as well as on synthetic petroleum, because Germany has no natural rubber and war would have been impossible without Farben's synthetic rubber production. As it turns out, Standard Oil of New Jersey was intimately associated with IG Farben's synthetic rubber production. A series of joint cartel agreements were made in the 1920s aimed at establishing a joint world monopoly of synthetic rubber production between these two companies, one American, one German. Delving deeper, Sutton informs us that American financiers were on the boards of several key IG Farben subsidiaries, such as American IG Chemical, with headquarters in New York, and German General Electric, also known as AEG, the European subsidiary for General Electric, the well-known American industrial giant and military contractor. On the topic of American IG, Sutton writes that, quote, the board of American IG had 3 directors from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most influential of the various Federal Reserve banks. American IG also had interlocks with Standard Oil of New Jersey, Ford Motor Company, Bank of Manhattan, which was later to become Chase Bank, and AEG, or German General Electric. Regarding Ford, Sutton informs us that in 1928, Henry Ford merged his German assets with those of the IG Farben chemical cartel. A substantial holding, 40% of Ford Motor AG of Germany, was transferred to IG Farben. And then Karl Bosch of IG Farben became head of Ford AG Motor Company in Germany. Simultaneously, in the United States, Edsel Ford joined the board of American IG Farben. Remember, this whole situation was initially set up and facilitated by the Dawes and Young war reparations programs of the 1920s. The BIS was set up to further facilitate it, and at some secret level, America's military and governmental leaders in the U.S. signed off on the plan. In particular, 3 of these corporate cartels mentioned, IG Farben, German General Electric, or AEG, and the United Steelworks, became the primary beneficiaries of the 3 largest loans handled by the Wall Street international bankers for German borrowers in the 1920s under the Dawes Plan. The subsequent reparations plan that eventually displaced the Dawes one, called the Young Plan, was named after Owen D. Young, an executive for General Electric. According to Sutton, Dawes was originally one of the 3 U.S. delegates to the 1923 Dawes Plan meeting, which established the original German reparations program. The cartelization of the German electric industry under AEG was made possible with these Wall Street loans. Later, in 1928, at the Young Plan reparations meeting, we find General Electric President Owen D. Young again involved, now placed in the chair as the chief U.S. delegate appointed by the U.S. government to use U.S. government power and prestige to decide international financial matters. 2 years later, in 1930, Young, after whom the Young Plan for German reparations was named, became the chairman of the board of German Electric Company in New York City. Young was also chairman of the Electric Committee of Radio Corporation of America and a director of both German General Electric AEG and Osram in Germany. Young also served on the boards of other major U.S. corporations, including General Motors, NBC, and RKO. Further, he was a counselor of the National Industrial Conference Board, a director of the International Chamber of Commerce, and deputy chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Altogether, we discovered during the interwar period a tight linkage being formed between American and German industrial cartels and banks, 2 entities vital to the functioning of the military-industrial complexes of both nations. So while millions of soldiers and civilians were dying in the conflict between Allied and Axis powers, the industrial cartels responsible for producing the instruments of war for both sides were actually linked together. To give yet another example, Sutton informs us that the 2 largest tank producers in Hitler's Germany were Opel, the wholly owned subsidiary of General Motors, controlled by the J.P. Morgan firm, and the Ford AG subsidiary of the Ford Motor Company of Detroit. Furthermore, in synthetic gasoline and explosives, 2 of the very basic elements of modern warfare, the control of German World War II output was in the hands of 2 German combines, IG Farben and United Steelworks, each created by Wall Street loans under the Dawes Plan. The level of collusion, corruption, and indifference to life being demonstrated here is truly shocking and disturbing. In every way, humanity's capacity for evil was being revealed during World War II. We all know about the bloody military battles and the atrocities associated with the concentration camps, but what about what was taking place among the civilized executives occupying the boardrooms of the major financial and industrial corporations who enabled all this to take place? And so we must ask ourselves, did it have to happen this way? Could nothing have been done to change this state of affairs? At root, this is a deeply philosophical question, and so ultimately it is to philosophy that we must look if we are to find answers. I plan to revisit this topic later on, but before delving deeper into the more existential aspects of it, let's see if we can't first pinpoint at least a few practical strategic concerns that the custodians of America's secret scientific research institution, the one probing into the mysteries of etheric energy, might have been grappling with, as they attempted to protect their secrets while covertly working to build out the architecture of a global civilization, one that one day might serve as a suitable home for their breakthrough technologies to be released into. If we can consider things from their perspective, maybe we can make better sense out of why things progressed, in the direction that they did. That's the end of that section. Once again, that was called Wartime Collusion Between German and American Industrial Cartels. And now we're moving on to the final section of this article, and this is called Searching for the Reason Why. All right, searching for the reason why. It is difficult, if not impossible, to come up with a satisfying explanation for why the situation described above happened like it did, without first delving into the mysteries of the secret program of scientific and technological research that was being conducted by the Nazi elite, or the SS, during the final phases of the Second World War. This secret research program, by necessity, took place under the watchful eye of IG Farben, United Steel, and German General Electric, the three primary industrial cartels behind the German military-industrial complex. Clearly, they had to be involved at a fundamental level. No government research project could exist without their input, since they were the ones who would do the financing, supply, and build-out of any such project. Usually, when historians bring up these powerful cartels, they discuss them as if they were passive instruments for the Nazis to use however they wished. In other words, most see them as being under the beck and call of Hitler, Bormann, and other prominent Nazi party leaders. But what if the opposite were instead true? That it was actually the Nazis who were the ones being secretly manipulated by the industrial cartels? After all, the Nazi state was almost entirely dependent on these private corporations for their funding, engineering, expertise, and ability to commandeer supplies and resources. Likewise, they were also dependent upon the bankers in the Reichsbank who provided them their financial services. As a result of this dependency, elite strategists within these industrial cartels therefore found themselves well positioned to quietly control and direct, from the top down, activities taking place within the inner recesses of both the Nazi state and its vast military-industrial complex. And if this were true for the Germans, could it not have also been true for the American government and its own military machine, dependent as it was on its own giant cartels like Standard Oil, General Electric, and the like, to carry out its own war-making agenda? Notably, these American corporations shared clear and direct links with their counterparts in Germany, as we've been exploring. Could hidden figures placed within these interlinked corporate cartels have been secretly running the show, directing the fate of covert military projects in America from within, while at the same time directing the unfoldment of things in Germany, making sure that overall world events played out in a certain pre-established direction during the war? Viewed from this perspective, it seems almost as if the complex system of interlocking cartels and financial relationships that we've been covering in this chapter was, from the outset, deliberately set up in order to establish this covert system of transnational military and industrial control. In this way, acting quietly behind the scenes, a hidden entity could direct the trajectory of wartime scientific and technological research taking place within both America and Germany. Was this the point? Through such a manner as this, events in each country could be coordinated so that a final pre-planned post-war end state could be achieved. It appears that the giant corporate cartels of IG Farben, General Electric, and others, financed and coordinated by the central bankers in the BIS, were the secret overseers of the whole war, directing both sides toward a pre-specified end state. Nothing could happen without their input and direction, since they were the ones responsible for financing, organizing, and supplying the war efforts. Being extensions of the national security state, these corporations operated under a policy of absolute secrecy, compartmentalization, and information control. Their private status protected them from government oversight, and their technologies were made proprietary, allowing them to retain monopolistic control over them. Because of their key strategic positioning, these cartels became ideal vehicles for the task of secretly organizing and coordinating the development of wartime scientific research into weapons development projects. In America, the Manhattan Project is one example of this. The Germans had their own version. Was this secret coordination of scientific research and technology development the true hidden function of these corporate cartels, with this secret activity being masked behind the outer traditional war-making production activities that these same corporations were performing for the outer militaries of each country? To grapple with this idea, we must again consider the larger historical context around which the scenario was taking place. In the previous chapter, we discussed how an alternate, secret paradigm of physics, research, and technology development was being prototyped in America during the mid to late 19th century, a paradigm that, around the turn of the century, went classified and all but disappeared from public record. The reason why this either model disappeared from public view was because of the world-changing implications of the breakthrough technologies that were already being developed in secret during the 19th century using it. These technologies include not only anti-gravity vehicles like flying saucers, but also free energy devices like Tesla's world wireless system. Meanwhile, the weapons applications of these technologies were truly terrifying and world-ending. Therefore, it seems to me that until a worldwide reformation in human affairs could be brought about, there was no possible way this research could ever be brought out into the light of day. Therefore, instead of the ether-based physics approach utilized in these closely guarded classified research projects, the outer world was given Einstein's relativistic model, an approach guaranteed to dead end from a technological standpoint. But of course, those scientists indoctrinated into this approach didn't know that this was the case. They thought they were on the cusp of a legitimate breakthrough in scientific thinking. Here's where we come to an interesting dynamic. America's Manhattan Project, its secret weapons development program to create the atomic bomb, was supposedly based around Einstein's model of relativistic physics. My feeling is that, while the research scientists in charge of this project were led to believe they were autonomously developing new breakthrough technologies based on this inaccurate physics model, behind the scenes, the whole enterprise was orchestrated and controlled by the industrial contractors and suppliers in charge of financing and building out the program. In other words, an elaborate program of worldview perception management was being enacted upon scientists like Oppenheimer, who believed they were building a weapon that operated according to a certain physics paradigm, but actually worked according to another. Simply put, I believe the Manhattan Project was an elaborate and complex form of psyop. In reality, I don't believe that atomic weapons actually worked the way they are professed to work, although none save a small number of initiated advisors actually knew this was the case. But it was important to convince not only the research scientists behind the work, but also the government and military supervisors backing it, that they actually did work according to Einstein's relativistic model. This would serve to legitimize Einstein's theory while distracting attention away from the entirely different paradigm of physics being researched in total secrecy behind the scenes. It is notable that many of the research scientists behind the Manhattan Project came from a Morgan and Rockefeller-funded think tank at Princeton, the Institute for Advanced Study. Scientists associated with this organization include Albert Einstein, Robert Oppenheimer, John von Neumann, and George F. Kennan, who became the architecture of America's post-war imperial strategy, or one of the architects. It seems likely that, by means of deep state instruments like Rockefeller and Morgan, who I believe were themselves out of the loop regarding the game behind the game that was being played, these scientists, each of whom was operating according to a non-ether based paradigm of physics, were carefully chosen and cultivated as marks, in order that, at the right time, they could be brought over to the Manhattan Project in order to play out their pre-appointed roles. This is just a theory, but I believe a well-substantiated one, given the material we've covered in this chapter and in the preceding one, where I unraveled in detail the problems with Einstein's relativistic model of physics. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Nazis were undergoing their own version of the Manhattan Project, one different in key ways from America's version. The Nazis, having abandoned Einstein's relativity model, dismissing it as Jewish physics, were beginning to experiment with weapons development projects based around the ether physics model of Tesla. Uh-oh. In the next article, we will track this story in more detail, but for now we should note that these German scientists were moving into this research realm not with the benefit of having access to all the developments that already had been achieved by groups like Sonora Aero Club in the 19th century. Rather, they appeared to have been kept ignorant of these older research projects and were therefore forced to reinvent the wheel. Because they had to start from scratch, rediscovering each step of the scientific discovery process one by one, this led them to being amenable to being guided and controlled from above by those who already understood the science well and knew the steps needed to make the real breakthroughs. Of course, this entire secret research program of the Nazis was overseen, supplied, and financed by the IG Farben industrial cartel. So the question becomes, were the Nazis really in charge of the program, or were they, like the American Manhattan Project scientists, the subject of a campaign of worldview perception management? The post-war fate of these secret Nazi research projects into the development of ether-based weapons technologies is telling. After making certain key discoveries, the war concluded before they could advance to the next level. Therefore, we must conclude that they made some progress, but ultimately didn't get very far. Then, after the war, their key research scientists were harvested by the American deep state and brought over to this country as part of the well-known Operation Paperclip project. Because certain breakthroughs were achieved by the Nazis independent of the Americans, when the American military discovered what the Nazis were doing, they realized that they needed to create a second, even more secret Manhattan Project to continue this research for their own use and control. Consequently, in harvesting the Nazi scientists, they came to embrace, at a very secret level, the beginnings of their own research into etheric energy, starting things off from the early and primitive stage that the Nazis had reached. Again, this left the Americans amenable to being steered and directed in their progress in a pre-planned direction by those knowledgeable on the science and what was needed to make the real breakthroughs in terms of its technological development. As I argued in the previous article, I believe that secretly this type of etheric energy technology research has been carried out in this country in an unbroken stream since at least the 19th century. But the overt leaders of America's national security state were kept ignorant of this fact. So the discovery of the Nazis' own research project into etheric energy allowed this idea to be introduced to the Americans as something foreign and novel. They could therefore embrace it and begin to build out the institutional infrastructure necessary to support it without them ever realizing or knowing that secretly such technologies have already been in development for decades, if not longer, within their own borders. In other words, a comprehensive worldview perception management strategy had been enacted on all parties and at all levels of the war. The oligarchs, the military planners, the Nazis, the Americans. Everyone was a target. The purpose of this appears to have been to formalize and legitimate the creation of an ether-based technological research project within the American national security state, one that would be kept off the books, but which would remain under the awareness and control of whatever secret societies are running its vast industrial cartel system. To conclude things for now, it is my view that the interlocking industrial and financial cartel structure that was put into place during the interwar period and solidified during World War II was actually part of a larger long-term project, one in which a secret scientific core within the American national security state was able to centralize and monopolize control over the trajectory of technological research development taking place across the world. While outwardly, industrial cartels like IG Farben and General Electric were colluding to monopolize the production of conventional warfare instruments and technologies, ones that were utilized in the war, inwardly, at a secret and deeply classified level, this was just a mask for their true activities, to control and direct the trajectory of breakthrough weapons technology research being conducted in both Germany and America. As a result of the war, Germany's weapons research program would be harvested by the American deep state. And this way, America's national security complex came to embrace, at a secret level, the lost paradigm of etheric physics. Events taking place in the post-war Cold War period further support this view, with the state of perpetual warfare and secrecy that the Cold War engendered within America, serving to support the formation of a permanent policy of total information control within America's national security establishment. These policies, of course, would also serve as a necessary shield for its secret body of scientific researchers to use to carry out their research to rediscover and redevelop for themselves in a closely watched manner the types of secret etheric energy technologies that various secret societies had already begun perfecting 100 years prior. In truth, these technologies already began to be developed as far back as the 19th century by an unknown network of secret societies, likely Masonically connected. But knowledge of these programs never made its way to the overt structure of America's military or capitalist oligarchy. Therefore, the Nazis' research program served as the chosen vehicle for a transmission to initiate America's outer elite military leadership into realizing that it was necessary for them to embrace a permanent secret research program into the development of ether-based technologies. In the meantime, a long-term campaign for world reformation would be pursued, outwardly by the American deep state and inwardly by these unknown secret societies, in order that one day a globally interconnected institutional order could be formed, one that would allow for these breakthrough technologies to finally be unveiled and utilized on a widespread basis. Today, 80 years after the conclusion of World War II, we find ourselves living in the world that secrecy has built. As far as I can tell, this is the story that explains why. And that's the end. So once again, that section was called Searching for the Reason Why. And my plan for the next article is to revisit some of the themes I was talking about there and to give a little bit more evidence. I just kind of threw out certain ideas that there is a lot of research to support them, such as the existence of these secret military research projects by the Nazis. And then, the harvesting of the scientists and the information in those research programs by the Americans after the war, through Operation Paperclip. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Soviet Union, which I haven't talked about. Anthony Sutton talks about in his research not only how in this key 20th century, early 20th century period, the Americans not only financed the Nazis, but they also financed the Soviet Union. And we talked a little bit about that in the earlier section when we first talked about World War One, how during the war, it was the Germans who financed the Bolsheviks in order to get Russia out of the war. Well, we're going to see that there was a deeper kind of game being played there, because the American capital was also involved in propping up this Bolshevik army. And so we're going to be discussing a little bit about that, and that'll also set the stage for talking about the Cold War. So we're going to see how the Cold War was a completely engineered operation in order to legitimate this structure that we're talking about, this sort of culture of secrecy and the need for developing breakthrough technologies, and how this technological development programs were sort of sectioned off into a hierarchy of programs that were compartmentalized from each other, but the deeper levels would be unknown to the outer levels. And so the Cold War really legitimated the creation of an all-encompassing national security state, and that was and is to this day actually the outer guise of these type of secret research projects. And so what I'm saying is that even at the innermost level, or the official levels of the U.S. government, whatever their most secret projects are, the stuff that Lockheed Martin and Boeing and stuff are involved with, that I think even at a yet deeper level is a much more advanced program of research, who has really already worked out the kinks, and because they've been doing it 100 years longer than the American version. There could be something even more advanced that already exists that's even off of the awareness and off the radar of these sort of national security projects. So if you can follow me, that if we remember what I was saying at the end of the last article about these four levels of frames that we're going through in the history of the 20th century, how there's like the outer frame of like the public, and then behind that there's the oligarchy, and then behind that there is this secret government, deep state research institution. But then there's that fourth level that now is merging into the esoteric level, and where something moves beyond the state and becomes more about the secret societies and Masonic organizations, Rosicrucians, Francis Bacon's Invisible College, things like that. So now that's moving into a level that's beyond any of this research that we're talking about in terms of the government. So I'm going to move into that last level at the very end of this chapter. But for now, I feel like it's necessary to build out this third level in detail. So that's what we're working with here. And we'll be continuing the story in the next couple articles. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in and stay tuned for this whole period. And I'll be back soon, hopefully, with that next article. And we'll continue this series on the secret history of the 20th century. Thank you, and God bless.